want to welcome you and thank you for coming to this election forum. And a disclaimer, since we are 100 feet within a polling station, we are not advocating for any candidates, policies, or judges, or any of that. And I'll say it loud and clear to the content. So we are not in any violation. Today, the title, Election 2016 Nativism and Nationalism and the November vote, is a much, I'd like to think, has a more profound goal in mind. And that is really to get us to think critically and consciously about our choices in that form of electoral politics, which is, albeit just one form of democratic participation. One form. And I'll expand on what I mean by our democratic norms, democracy, a little bit, but we'll stay here for hours if we take on the notion of democracy. But I just want to illustrate the fact that the electoral process, when we go into that room and get that sticker, is a small part of enacting political and social change. Right? And we have a history to prove that. So this moment, I just want to begin by introducing my colleague, my comrade, Dr. Scott Lucas. Teaches anthropology and sociology here for how many years now?
I think it's 17 or 18.
Yeah, you lose track after a while. And I'm Dr. Albert Ponce. I teach history, political science, and ethnic studies here at LTCC. So come on in, grab a cookie. But what I want us to think about today is really to think about where we are as a nation, where we have come from, where we are in this moment, and what we want to see. What we want to see. So these drive us to really think beyond the choices that are there in front of us on that ballot, but a more deeper reflection on how the nation ought to be. So that'll shift us to an ethical domain, a domain of thinking about society as how it ought to be constructed, not on how it is. A vast distinction when we think about our reality. Right? Just because things are not how they should be does not mean that they cannot be. Right? So what we have here today is this candidate, Donald Trump. Can't get away from him. Okay? It's a few months away from becoming the chief executive of the United States. So in the age of fantasy and reality TV, Trump has been perceived as an entertainer like no other. But what I want to point to is rather than an aberration, his ascendance should be seen as a continuity and the force of what I mean by nativism and nationalism in American politics. Right? So this anti-nativism, this anti-foreign sentiment has always existed in the United States. That is at the core of what it means to be American, and that's what I will be illustrating today. So today, all of us in this room are confronted. How do we want to redefine or maintain America as it should be, or as it ought to be, or to see its potential? So while much has been made of his love of the poorly educated and exploiting the anger of the white working classes, his appeal is more far-reaching than with ill-informed pundits, where we receive most of our political information, and they are ill-informed, they are not experts who are informing us. Right? So that information that we're receiving is at a level of superficiality, and it's more meant to entertain rather than to inform. That is the nature of media and politics that we're in. But what I'm advocating is that this has been the mainstay. So in the early 2000s, Harvard political scientist, very influential, Samuel Huntington, having already declared the clash of civilizations and the threat of Islam as our external threat, turned his focus to the internal terrain of the United States to highlight how is our identity of America being threatened. So specifically, he moves to question the Hispanic challenge that we have in front of us. This was in 2004. He made headways because quickly he takes his focus, not unlike Donald Trump today, on Mexicans. He went from that sort of pan-ethnic identity of Hispanic, Latino, to target Mexican cultural and societal practices and norms. So his nativist fear was not new. This had been part and parcel of what drives our idea of what is American, as the framers in 1790 explicitly made clear who is to be a citizen, free whites only. And that has been further upheld over time in naturalization law and policy, and it is very much with us here in the present, in this domain. So, what I'm going to present today is really get us to think about how party politics, going back to the domain of two institutional structures that we have to choose from in this idea of democracy that we have in front of us, first we should ask, is that very democratic when we only have 2 choices? We have others, but they're fringe, and we'll talk about those also. So, when we think about this, and we wear our, I'll pick on Evelyn here, who has her sticker in front of me, we think that that is the end-all of our democratic participation. And I will say, no, that is very minimal. Very minimal. Because any change that has occurred, whether it was a gender, we'll be addressing that today, racial, class dimension, it has come from below, democracy from below. Social movements that enact that. So today, when 1790, when this nation was established as a white nation explicitly, that was the goal. By establishing this project, this racial project, is achieving its crescendo with Trump today. So the Republican Party is coalescing around this seemingly unstoppable candidate. But what I want to argue is we cannot bracket the demagoguery, the racism, the misogynist attributes of this one candidate and take it away from the party itself. We are at a moral crossroads, those of us who identify with that party. Right? That is the dilemma. That's the dilemma we face, and it's hard to confront. So much like the Democratic Party before we see, as we all watch MSNBC, CNN, Fox, and we see those states, right? We see the map. Before those states were red, they were blue. The Democrats were the upholders and of white supremacy in the United States up until the Southern strategy, where the Republican Party employs the category of race and racial discrimination to build the party platform in that period of the civil rights, resentment towards civil rights. So Muhammad Ali died this weekend, and some of our students were having a discussion about how he's a hero and a great person to all. Not so. He was vilified and hated in that moment for standing up for human rights, the rights of black people. So we tend in America to gloss over the ugliness and focus on the good stuff, which are good stuff. So what I want to declare today is Huntington declared, as many American leaders before him, that the preservation of white supremacy rooted in Anglo-Protestantism remains a priority of these United States. That's what is front and center once we begin to ask questions about our reality in the present. What is really at the core that is driving these movements? So history, and I want to say, history is here. History is now. History is being made. You are all historical actors once we are conscious of our choices. Will hold no cover for those who claim colorblindness. Right? So those of us who identify as Republican, 2 parties, right? Republican, oh yeah, he's bad, but I was still like the leaders of the Republican Party, Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell, who'll say, well, yeah, it's problematic, and it is pretty racist, but I'm a partisan. I have to support the racist candidate. That's what he's saying, in fact. It is bad, but I'm willing to claim that, but not go so far as to say this is abhorrent, this is not the nation I want to see, that is built and focused on racism as a mobilizing factor, where we see millions. So what I want to draw us to is not those explicit race. When I'm talking about white supremacy, not neo-Nazi groups, it is that ideology of a social, political, and economic system of domination over those who are not. And I could explain there, but we have a Q&A. So, as the Democrats before them, now the Republicans must be held accountable. And that is not to bracket off, make these general distinctions, that there are no racists in the Democratic Party. There are millions. Right? But the focus right now, when we pull the ballot, we are pulling the ballot. We cannot bracket and disentangle racism from the Republican Party because they are the explicit defenders of this institution, white supremacy. And I'll make that very clear. So nativism, anti-foreign sentiment. Right? What drives our movement to the polls to get that sticker? We should build a wall of brass around the country. Few of their children in the country learn English, and language is big. The signs in our streets have inscriptions in both languages. That troubles our identity of what it means to be America. Anybody want to guess who said this? The first one. You're 2 different folks. So we'll focus. Build a wall. Sounds like Trump, right? That was John Jay, one of our American founders and authors of the Federalist Papers. One of the folks that we edify in American political theory and philosophy was a nativist. Right? The second one, the easy guess would be Trump again, right? Benjamin Franklin. We all know Benjamin Franklin. Right? Be thrifty. all the dictums that we get from Benjamin Franklin, was also a very ardent, and these are just glimpses. And so in the 1750s, prior to the establishment of the Constitution, the nation had already, this new nation, that was not a nation of immigrants, but a nation built on settler colonialism, right? And genocide and the extermination of many nations that existed on this terrain. So we begin history with that notion that that we are a nation of immigrants, and I can elaborate on that some more when we sort of disrupt that myth. So nationalism, those of my students will see this familiar. What is nationalism? Red, white, and blue, right? Red, white, and blue, or any nation, right? We have some people from Britain in the room. British, right? Britain is taking on the boat right now of exiting from the European Union, and one of the arguments is it tarnishes being British, their identity. And again, you see some disconnect with age demographics there. We'll talk about that some more. But Benedict Anderson, in his groundbreaking work, Imagined Communities, tells us a little bit about how nationalism comes into being. It comes into being as an imagined community. How do we all become bound, and say we are all American? We all look different, right? This is a big country, over 300 million people. How can I identify with somebody in Massachusetts, beyond Dr. Kingsbury, who's here in the room? I'll never meet them. I've never traveled to Massachusetts, but yet we have something in common. This comes into, in our imaginary, what it means to be American. It is imagined, it is limited, and the idea of sovereignty. And I can elaborate on this more as we move, but how do we do that? Have a quick reflection. What is our idea of being American? Is it our duty of just going on this one day in California, June 7th, and pulling the lever, or however we do it now? So it is an imagined community, regardless of the actual inequality and exploitation that is very real. Very real. Right? We have a very hierarchical system in this country, where even the poorest of the poor, who are a big voting population, are willing sometimes to vote against their interests because they see themselves as that candidate. These two elite politicians who will elect and who we will choose from in November are not the most qualified folks in the nation, the most educated to lead this nation. Where did they come from? They came from the system of inequality, privilege, and benefit over time. So, and we are willing, not so much as to kill, but to die for it, right? For symbols. Right? And we'll be talking about that some more. A flag. How does that happen? How do we come to think of it? So selling nativism and patriotism. And so here we have the very patriotic Katy Perry, moving for Hillary Clinton, her red, white, and blue, voting patriotic. Anheuser-Busch, the Belgian owned. Anheuser-Busch is, we're America. And Trump was right. They should thank him for that. I think he is right. Because corporate America, Wall Street, however you want to call it, they're banking off of his success. He's tapping into the core of what it means to be America. And that is driven by nativism and reinforced by patriotism and acting your duty. Right? And there will be billions made over the Summer Olympics. You can see all these ads for your favorite candies, donuts, everything will be sold to you in red, white, and blue. That reinforces, that further socializes us into thinking. And if we think that, well, Americans are just patriotic, let's look at the economic force. These are teams, if you follow sports like I do, and this was a report developed for Senators Jeff Flake and John McCain on the spending by the Department of Defense in Major League Baseball, the National Hockey League, and the NFL as the biggest benefit, spending $9 million of our dollars to reinforce that patriotism. So have you ever watched a football game and you see, oh, here's a soldier comes down and surprises his family? You ever seen that? They were paid to do that. Right? The organization, and lots of money. Falcons benefit Atlanta's popular spot to go and reenact these patriotic moments. So just like we reenacted that, that photo on Iwo Jima we have, we all know that picture. These are actually crafted by corporate American in alignment with the Department of Defense at our cost. Right? We pay for that to be made. We feel good. Oh, look at that! Our soldiers are doing great. And when soldiers, the NFL takes on those emblems of red, white, and blue, they're paid for that too. Big business in selling patriotism and reinforcing what it means to be American here today. Powerful forces, not all very explicit like this, but these images, right? So as Muhammad Ali, the late great or the greatest, Muhammad Ali, stood up. He said, no, I'm willing to challenge, and gave up the best years of his life, gave up millions to stand on principle. That is not so well compensated, because that's seen as anti-patriotic. You're being called an American. That's un-American. That's anti-patriotic. So I will just move real quickly. I would really want to hand it over to my colleague. But what is the future? Because the future demographic change is real. You know, by 2043, those were your last time, whites will be a majority minority group. So how do Latinos, Asian Americans, blacks, and Muslims fit into the idea of the United States? Well, that is playing itself out right now. Right? The tensions that are boiling over into political violence. So these are just some numbers of the Asian American vote and their tendency, the blue. You know, we tend to simplify things with Democratic party affiliation for Asian Americans in the last, in 2012, and how they've declined for the Republican Party. Black presidential vote, pretty solid. Democrats, we see that shift from the 60s when the Republican Party enacted the Southern Strategy to vilify black folks and build on the resentment of those whites who had given up too much, meaning equality or school integration for black folks. So we see this become solid, about 90%. In the Latino vote by state, you see in the last presidential election, about close to 75% went for the Democratic Party. And it is not that the Democratic Party is a great party, but there is no other choice. It is pretty clear to those groups how they're being targeted. So you might take the idea of building a wall. Oh, there's no hatred in that. Right? There's no hate. Those who it's focused upon feel the thrust of that violence or the potential violence. You can ask folks of Jewish descent. If you say, build a camp, what does that tap into? Right? That is hate. And that is violence. So that's the stage where we're at, where we need to call, as a society, really think about the normative values that we want to see our nation to be. And also, if we are aligned with a certain party that is saying, well, yeah, he's a racist, but, you know, that's our party. No, you have to do more. Some are doing that. And it's not that there are no alternatives. You know, there is a Libertarian Party ticket, right? Which I see, we'll talk about that some more. And this is some polling that was done by Latino Decisions, America's Voice, with a pretty sizable, we'll talk about polling and how to interpret polls, because you're going to be inundated with polls. Some are so flimsy that we can build a better poll right now in 5 minutes and tell us nothing. This is, the N is 2,200, pretty sizable, statistically significant. Yes, Dr. Green? Yes, okay, thank you. And this is prior to the rhetoric over the weekend and its continuity aimed at this group. So I'm sure it's probably a few points bigger into the 80s, right? We can hypothesize. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Dr. Scott Lucas now, who will be taking on some of these issues. And then we're going to open it up for Q&A, which we're really interested to get some dialogue going on this, because that's what we need as a nation, not just as a community. Thank you.